Woo! Welcome to 23 Degrees Sideways. We're getting through a lot of stuff this morning. I've got more to talk about, and sometimes the videos get a little long. I wanted to talk a little more about what happened over the last 4, 6, 8, 10 years. You may not be old enough to remember, but the 1980s was they called it the decade of greed. It wasn't so much the decade of greed, in a way it was, but it wasn't so much the decade of greed as it was a decade in which life changed for a lot of people. The disposable income level went up. Technology really shifted some things around. And things changed a lot. One of the things that happened was that people tended to ignore the establishment, the corrupt establishment, to a large degree because they were busy doing things like making money. In the 90s, some point in time in the 90s, the corrupt establishment became a very big deal. They were killing people. Okay, and you can look at things like Waco or Ruby Ridge. You can look at how the media followed the government line to talk about these things and the myths that were put in place and the lies. But Americans knew, lots of Americans knew that kids were being burned alive by the government. The establishment went too far. You had the peak in the 90s. You know, we talk about satanic panic in the 80s, but the peak of implanting memories and false accusations and engineering children to testify, that was all in the 90s, okay? That the establishment really hammered on people in the 90s. Establishment corruption, taxes, government programs, it was a really big deal in the 90s. And I'm not going to say that Bush was immune to that, but Clinton really steered. He was the steersman for that. He was the captain of the ship for much of that, okay? That's a pretty big deal, okay? That corruption level is actually a lot of what got Bush into office. The establishment corruption was extreme. It had been going on for a while. We've complained about it since the 50s. You know, we've complained about it before, but since the 50s is when we got the federalization, the nationalization of things starting. In the 70s is when we actually got the regulations to make national parties, to make establishment corruption mandatory. Literally mandatory. It's the way it works. And then by the 90s, we had really peaked, okay? Really, really peaked. And so in the early 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s, you know, we watched that and we complained about it, and there were ups and downs to it. And then, of course, we started getting movements probably around 2012, because 2008 was supposed to be hope and change, but it ended up being such a false promise so fast. You may or may not remember, Obama campaigned on an idea of transparency. Transparency like we got with Donald Trump, but transparency, a huge amount of transparency was promised, and it became the most closed White House in history. Obama became the most anti-press White House in history. More people were charged, more people were convicted, more people were pursued by the government as press, as journalists under Obama than anyone else. And it was pretty bad. And somewhere, you know, we had the promise in 2008, and people bought into it. Somewhere around 2012, we started really going against the establishment. The revolution movement started really pushing. And it was not just in the United States. You saw it in England, you saw it in Hungary, you saw it in... You see the movements in Germany, in Italy, in France. You see the movements all through the West. You also see them in places like Korea and Japan. Even in China, which is a little bit difficult to decipher because there are some, in addition to cultural differences, it's literally a communist dictatorship with concentration camps, and it's a little hard to see things. But this anti-establishment movement has been a big deal for a while, and starting around 2012 is when it really started pushing. And the push back from the establishment worshippers has been just as hard, And there are people who say that they want to fight the establishment who are very authoritarian. I think this is one of the problems. I mentioned Dan Carlin in a previous video. I think this is one of the problems that Dan Carlin has had, is that there's a mixing of groups. There's no fine delineation. There's no broad Sharpie mark that says you're on this side and you're on that side. There are a lot of people who are anti-establishment, but who are very authoritarian. Their idea of ending the corrupt establishment is to take it over and make it theirs and run it their way and have their own corruption. And they don't see it as corruption because what they're doing is right. Anything goes, any rule can be broken as long as you're doing it for the right reasons. And that's kind of the ultimate corruption, when you corrupt yourself. I think Dan got tied up, got lost in the weeds a little bit with this one, because you have a lot of the anti-establishment people who don't actually like what happens when anti-establishment movements succeed. The idea of, hey, the establishment has pushed all of these things on me and I don't like them, so we're just going to end that. He didn't want that. He wanted them done, ethically, without corruption. The nuclear weapons aren't going to go away. You need to have strong nation states to handle nuclear weapons. I understand that. There's going to be some sort of establishment, but that establishment should not be trying to regulate your children gathering eggs on your own homestead. That was an Obama-era issue, and it became a very big issue. Although the media didn't report on it a lot, there were a lot of letters to Congress. It got axed. It got stopped. Millions of people, complained about it. It wasn't their hill to die on, But being against establishment corruption means having limits on the establishment. I understand nuclear weapons require a strong central government, but my food supply does not. Okay? My education does not. My children's education does not. And the corruption comes when the establishment... Corruption comes with establishment, but the corruption gets worse when the establishment gets overly large without a reason. I can understand. I can give you a reason. I can show you logical necessities for a central government and nuclear weapons that go together. Okay? You can't show me a logical necessity for a central establishment, federal system, and local education. You can't show me where those compare. And when you don't have that reason, then you get more corruption, because you don't have a guiding purpose. You don't have a limit. You don't have a specific thing going on. And I think Dan Carlin got tied up with a lot of the progressive thought about cleaning up the establishment but not limiting the establishment. And when things happened, when the revolutions started happening, the ones that he'd been predicting for decades, he didn't like the look of people saying, no, you don't get to eliminate my job. So establishment corruption in Europe. Let's talk about the EU for a moment, because Brexit came down, no matter what the media said, Brexit came down to a couple of very simple things. One is so-called free trade agreements are never free trade agreements. British people, the British middle class, was being eliminated by Southern European, Mediterranean cheap labor, which you weren't allowed to do anything about because because free trade meant that you couldn't protect your industries, your workers, your country, your borders. Okay? You give up your livelihood in the name of somebody else's free trade, and then you don't even get to vote on what's going on because the EU is essentially an aristocratic closed system. Well, yes, your response to that, your anti-establishmentarianism to that, is not going to be globalist. It's not going to be, we need a bigger EU. It's going to be a, fuck the EU. England first. Carlin wasn't very good at dealing with that. He didn't understand. I don't think he's ever understood that part of things. When I listen to the Hardcore History series, because I love his history shows, it's another point where he seems to have kind of a blind spot for cultural identity and that aspect. He'll talk about it a little bit, but he really doesn't get it. He never gets inside that identity that you are the other. There are always others, okay? You are the other who is defeating me and my family. That creates an identity, and he's never been very good with that, And I think that's one of the things that he really lost it with the 2012 through 2016 series of revolutions. Brexit wasn't about a bunch of racists wanting to be racist. It was about a bunch of middle-class British people wanting to have a British middle-class existence and not being permitted to do that with the EU. It's not that they're trying to say, no, brown people aren't allowed to live. It's that, no, you're destroying my culture. You can't destroy my culture. When the establishment starts attacking your culture, things go really wrong. So that's a big deal. It's a bigger deal than people want to admit. And that's a lot of what happened in the United States. We have an establishment that is trying to engineer a different society. They're trying to engineer, quite literally, an Orwellian society. And remember that George Orwell was a socialist. Okay, his writings were definitely cautionary tales. But his idea was that the socialism part was still there, inevitable part of structure. And I think one of the big problems here is that you can't have that without the Animal Farm, without the 1984. You can't do it. Okay? That's part of the problem. And a lot of people who promote socialism don't get that that's part of the problem. They always think that they can escape that. So, as the establishment rolls on, it gets ever more corrupt. We fought it, but the people who wanted to end establishment corruption who were not, let's say, libertarian minded. I don't want to use that word because I'm not referring to capital L, the libertarians, but people who are liberty minded, who are freedom minded, who are individualistic. Those are the people who really got the revolution, got the ball rolling, the anti-establishment ball rolling. But people like Dan Carlin, the people who wanted to end establishment corruption but keep the establishment large, they'd never been able to understand that or appreciate that, because the problem with individualism is that it's individualistic. And people do different things, and sometimes they do weird shit and believe weird shit, and it's never going to look like the progressive or libertarian unanimous structure, one thought structure where everyone thinks the same so everything works. It's never going to be like that. It's always going to be very messy and sloppy. And establishments hate that. Bureaucracies hate that. They live for order. And now we've had a backlash to the revolution, and people are scared to be seen as sloppy, messy, horrible, evil individualists. And that's not going to last. Best thing about this is that's not going to last. People are going to start celebrating their individualism again. And that's going to throw a wrench in the works, I think, for the progressives, because the progressives, for all that they talk about this, they're very, very provincial, very locksteppy, very selfish. Selfish is important because they're selfish, self-centered, and they're very addicted to appearances. So when you get more freedom, you're more liberty, you're people caring about that, they're going to tend to go that direction. I make a comment sometimes about hippie farmers, all right? Homestead stuff, right? I'm in the homestead community. There are a lot of very left-oriented hippie farmers out there who go out and they're like, yeah, Bernie Sanders, yeah, Joe Biden, yeah, whatever. Not Joe Biden, but Obama. Biden lost them. And they get out there and they start farming. And they start having to actually live. They start having to do the money part and the work part. You know, they're growing their food, they're doing their organic farm, they're doing their orchard, they're growing their organic pigs, whatever it is they're doing. And the paperwork and the taxes come in. And all of a sudden these people get very, very libertarian really fast. They still like the idea of feed the poor, you know, school lunches, everything. But when it comes to the actual structure of a socialist government, they get really pissed off and they diss it really fast. They avoid it. They get very piratatical, whatever. They become pirates. They get very libertarian, very they become economic dissenters. They become dissidents because they're not going to file 16 forms to try to figure out how to do a new water trough because the EPA said this. No. That's stupid. The animals are going to die and I'm going to go broke. That's a key element. As people do their individual stuff, individual things happen, and bureaucracy breaks down, and you get more and more scofflaws. When you don't respect the laws, pretty soon you start not respecting the government, and then you get to that whole revolution side of things. I think you're going to see that coming down the road really soon. And yeah, you're going to have to open your eyes. If you're on the right and you're on the conservative side and you're one of the super conservative homestead prepper people, you're going to have to open up and accept that hippies are preppers too. You know, there's room for all of the belief structures. That's one of the things you got to remember. Individualism means individual belief structures. Remember that. Not everyone's going to believe like you. Your God, your morals, your specific work ethic, none of that is universal. And none of it is written in stone. Even if your religion says it is, it's not. You're going to have to accept that individuals have individual choices. Free will is one of those things that I think most religions say is written in stone. So allow people their own choice. They have to find heaven or hell their way on their own. Because you're going to see a lot more people abandoning the leftist establishment as it becomes more authoritarian. Leave room for those people. Okay? You don't have to love them, but you have to accept them. Stay sideways, and let's get it on.